Yesterday I went on the internet and I searched around and I found a few things about the Grizzly problems I'm having. First off, about the pull starter. Turns out a lot of people have complained or voiced opinions about how the pull starter works on these. Most people agree that the pull starter is very hard to turn. They talk about, a couple of people talked about how there is a compression release built in, which I know about on the camshaft, but that's really there just to help the starter crank the engine a little bit better, and they don't believe it's really they intended to really help you that much when it comes to pull starting. They all said, all of the people that had problems and figured out how to work around it all felt that it was really a matter of technique, proper technique. You know, a few people even talked about how it'll bite you, and did that to me a couple times yesterday, where it kicks back right when you go to pull it and practically yanks the rope out of your fingers and tears your knuckles off. But basically, they said what you're supposed to do is pull very, very slowly to the point where it first gets right through the compression stroke, and then let it fully go all the way, and then give it a quick jerk from that point. And that's like presetting it so that you've got the best chance of getting a good pull without it jerking back on you, or locking up on you and ripping your tendons out of your elbow. So I'm not really concerned about the way that the pull start's acting. Apparently, I'm just not used to the fact that that's how this particular pull start tends to be. And then the other issue was, a lot of people talked about backfiring the carburetor. Most people's opinions were that it was carburetor related, in particular running too lean. Many people suggested adjusting the pilot screw out. When I adjusted this yesterday to try and see if it would change things, I actually turned it in a half turn. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it out a full turn, which will be back to where it was when I started yesterday, plus a half turn out, and see if that improves things at all. If that doesn't do anything for me, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the carburetor apart again, because it sure seems like the problem might be related to a problem in the pilot air circuit part of the carburetor. And I did clean the carburetor, but I may have just missed a passage somewhere, a small orifice or passage, and that could be the entire problem. But first I'm going to see if adjusting that pilot screw makes any difference. Alright, I've pulled this out, brought the screw out, the pilot air screw out, about another full turn now, and still no change, still acting the same way. So I'm going to pull the carburetor. Alright, I've taken the carburetor apart again, and I think where my problem lies is in the pilot air adjustment or circuit, and I'm not positive exactly how the fuel flows through this particular carburetor, but the pilot air screw adjustment screwed in right here, and right at the bottom of that there's a hole, which I made sure that hole was clear the first time I cleaned it. That hole goes right in to the throat of the carburetor. So that's obviously how the fuel gets metered into there, is by the how far this point on this screw is actually turned in. The question is, how does the fuel get into that area around the screw before it gets pulled in through that hole into the throat of the carb? And that's what I haven't been able to determine yet. But I believe that where it's supposed to come from is through this small jet, because this is your main jet right here for your high RPMs, and the only other jet in here is this one that I just showed right here, which came out of right here. So my theory is that the fuel is supposed to be drawn up from the bowl through that jet into here, and then go through a passage that can't be seen, and end up coming into here. On the end here, there's a little dimple that would indicate that that's the end of a passage. So it's kind of hard to see, but also looks like there's a small hole in the bottom of this right here. So that could also be your, that could also be where it's supposed to get in. Not quite sure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and squirt some carburetor cleaner right into this hole right here and see if any of it shows up in here. That's definitely it. I put the straw right in there, angled it right into that hole there on the side of the this orifice, and it shot out of here. So that's definitely how that gets into there. And then there's 3 tiny holes in the bottom of that little recess right there, and those 3 holes, I made sure all 3 of those are clear. They all go straight into the throat also. They're right below where the butterfly is, throttle butterfly. So those are clear. This little tiny tube right here actually runs out the side here. That's this tiny tube that goes up to your choke circuit. So that's the way that works. Is the choke plunger goes in here, and the choke is placed in the on position. The plunger is pulled out, fuel is drawn up from the bowl and allowed to go through a port in the side there you can't see and come out this big port right on the side here. So that's how you get a really rich mixture when you're starting. The vacuum on the intake stroke pulls the fuel right up out of the bowl and throws a good sized spray in there. I put the hose right on here and squirted fuel right in there, and it came out from the main jet area here, so that passage appears to be fine. This over here was where that other small jet was screwed into, and then we also have a port right here. Looks like it goes over to this thing right here, which I neglected to take apart the first time, so I'm going to open that up and see what's inside there. Okay, behind here there is a couple of ports. There's that port right there, goes right to the intake side. This port right here looks like it might go right to where I took that jet out. And then there's clearly a port here where the fuel looks like it enters from up here somewhere. Maybe even the choke circuit. So let's squirt some fluid through there. And then on this, give you an idea what this looks like on the back here. Clear by the way the gasket is made that fuel is supposed to enter and exit through this in a certain way. Gonna have to take this cap off and see what's under there. There is a little bit of corrosion shown on this, so we'll see what's inside here. But first I'll shoot some carb cleaner through these ports. Okay, this appears to be almost like a fuel pump. Maybe it's like an accelerator pump. So let me take these 2 short screws off so they fall off. You gotta be careful taking this off. I took the cap off and it was spring loaded and the spring went flying, so I gotta find the spring. And then also I noticed when I pulled this diaphragm up, grab it real quick. Take a look in there, you can see it's got a lot of corrosion. This little tiny ball in the bottom there that probably acts as a check valve. So looks like that unscrews and exposes that ball, and there's probably another spring in there. You can take that out and probably clean it. So I'm going to try that. Okay, this little brass cover here with the slot in it, I would have thought that would unscrew and expose that little, what looks like a ball and probably spring behind it. And it turns and doesn't unscrew. So I don't know if it's supposed to just kind of be pulled out, but I'm not going to force it. So instead what I did was I cleaned it up by putting the straw from the carb cleaner right in there best I could. and also put some carb cleaner in on this end. Cleaned all that white corrosion stuff out of there as best I could. I'm going to brush that out a little bit better. Well, here's the spring that went flying. No wonder why. Big enough. It's compressed down quite a bit to fit in there on top of that diaphragm. Well, I've cleared every passage I can find and squirted carb cleaner through it. And at this point I'm going to reassemble it and put it back on the quad and see if that solves the problem. I tried following the advice of people online on exactly how to pull start this thing without ripping your knuckles out, and I still was having trouble and hurting my hands, so I decided to rig something up a little better so I could use this battery. So I made up a couple of extensions with some heavy copper wire so that I can use this battery. So now I can crank the engine, so I don't have to worry about dealing with this pull start while I'm working on it. Okay, my temporary gas tank's hooked back up. Everything's hooked back up on the carb. And now for the moment of truth. Choke on. Looks like we're still back to the same old problem. As soon as I shut the choke off, back to the cough and die scenario. Aha! Well, it died while I was messing with it and wouldn't restart at all. And then I checked my little auxiliary tank and realized it was empty and I had barely put any fuel in there. So I decided to top that off, and when I hooked it back up and I positioned it so that fuel would flow into the carburetor, fuel started gushing out of the throat of the carburetor and this vent line. There's supposed to be a vent hose hooked up to here, but essentially what that tells me is that I've got a problem with the float in this carburetor, and that might be part of my whole problem here. So I've got to figure out what's going on with that. But the float is not working right now correctly, and I gotta take the carburetor off again. Alright, took the carburetor apart to adjust the float, and I did, when I went and got the paperwork out of the service manual to check on how to adjust the float, I did notice something. There's a note here on installing the needle jet that you're supposed to align the groove on the needle jet with the projection on the carburetor body. There's a picture showing that, and what they're talking about is this little flat, this little groove right here on the side of that is actually supposed to be lined up with this little nub that sticks out right here. And instead, so that would be at about 6 o'clock looking down at it, and right now it's at about 10 o'clock. I'm wondering whether or not that might be a problem. I remember when I did the Mikuni carburetor on the Arctic Cat, that when I slid this in on the Arctic Cat carburetor, it really kind of like had a keyed way that it went in, and when I tightened the needle jet, it stayed put. This one turns, so I'm going to take this back out. Okay, so I've taken this out. I compared it against the original one I took out, and it is identical. But now when I reinsert it, I'm going to take care to try and make sure that it goes in the proper way. Now this is installed correctly. This groove is now facing this little projection here on the carburetor body. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if that was causing major problems. Because if it was no big deal about which way this went in, then they wouldn't go through the trouble of keying this and telling you to make sure it goes in that way. Now to check the float height, you invert the carburetor, with the float installed, the little part right here should be pressing on the needle but not compressing it. And one of the ways you can make sure that that's seated is what I do is I just blow into the fuel line here and gently, and you should have resistance. You can lift up on the float a little bit and you can actually hear the air come out and then lower it back down again. So in this position you want to make a measurement from this surface here with no gasket on it to the top of the float right here, and you want that measurement to be 14.7 millimeters or 0.59 inches. And if it's not correct, then you need to bend this little metal tab a little bit to correct it. So I set my vernier caliper to 0.59 inches, and then I just place it right on here and I make that measurement. Now I'm going to put the camcorder down so I can do this more accurately. Alright, it looks pretty good. I just want to make a note here that when the bowl is on here, it actually pushes down on these plastic tabs and kind of pushes this like frame part down. And you'll notice that right now it's up a little bit. So if I push it down a tiny bit to where it's fully seated, you'll see the float comes level. And that's where you want it to be when you make your measurement. So if I measured it right there, it would be actually wrong. But if I hold it to where the position would be when it's all put together, right there, that would be the correct measurement, and it's actually good. And the other thing is some guys actually will just tell you that if the float's level, if you notice that line going across the float is almost parallel to the top of this surface right here is almost level or parallel to that line right there. Now I'd like to do one last little check, which is a step that I usually do when I reassemble a carburetor float bowl, and I skipped it last time and I'm sorry I did. And that's I blow into this tube with the carburetor level and make sure that I can hear air blowing into the bowl, and then I invert the carburetor upside down and try and blow into it. I should feel a stoppage, and then I just make sure that I have that float freely moving, that it's not hanging up on something, especially with this carburetor, because getting this bowl on is tricky because there's a vent line that this little tube here goes to that sticks straight up into the bowl at an angle, and you have to kind of finesse this on there and get it right in the right location to get the bowl on at the same time you're trying to make sure you don't dislodge the needle from the seat or the bowl frame, screw something up. So it's a pain in the ass. Okay, it's getting late, but I just couldn't wait to try this out again. So I've got the carburetor reinstalled. I've got the choke hooked up. I didn't bother hooking up the accelerator, the throttle cable, because you know, I'm going to see if it's going to idle properly and if my problems are solved. So the first thing I did was I reinstalled my temporary tank. Now I keep it down here below level. It's going to not allow fuel to go up into the carburetor. So I've got a way I can just basically simulate a fuel shut off. If I bring the tank up here above the level of the carburetor, fuel's going to flow through the line and fill the bowl, and hopefully my float's going to hold. So I'm going to do that now. And now fuel is flowing at this point out into the carburetor, and just hold this up level, and my float is holding. So now I know my float is not hanging up like it was before. And now the other question is, the only thing I've done differently since the last time besides fix the float was I reoriented that jet that was supposed to be in alignment and was not. I'm hoping that's what my whole problem was. I'm about to find out. Now it looks like I'm right back to where I started. that's what I'm getting, just a cough and a die. I'm going to back out that pilot screw 1/2 turn, see if that helps. I'll try keeping the choke on. As soon as I shut the choke off, it lowers in RPMs and dies. Well, now let me just go into the theory that it's sucking air and running too lean because I don't have this cover on where the throttle cable goes on. I'm gonna get some duct tape and put a sheet of it right over that and try and block that off and see if anything changes. Well, I backed it out about almost another full turn on the pilot screw, and it seemed to have gotten better. Definitely, it's running longer now before it dies. I'm just surprised that starting at an initial starting point of 3.5 turns out, I've now gone about 4.5 turns out on that adjustment. But I'll go another half turn and see what happens. Alright, let's see how this works. Now the problem there is now it's racing. It won't idle. RPMs are too high, so I'll turn the screw back in a little bit. Well, that's about the longest I've had it running so far. I turned the pilot screw back in to where the engine stopped racing, and it runs and coughs about every 10 seconds or 5 seconds, but it's able to stay running through about 4 or 5 of those coughs before it finally fails again.